the whole thing. Do you want me to do an intro? Wait, turn that off first. On that note, welcome to the Green Party.
That's the business part of the meeting. Those are the only things I had.
Okay.
Something else. Yeah.
Are we recording already?
Yes, we are.
Oh.
Are you sure? Okay. Dr. Karen Weingarten is the editor of the new book, Abortion Stories, American Literature Before Roe v. Wade, which was published just 2 weeks ago by Penguin Classics. She's associate chair of the Department of English at CUNY, which is
no longer.
She was.
I was, yeah. Go ahead.
Your information is out of date.
I thought it was changed, but I think pages get cached and then they don't get updated. Yeah.
Well,
but that's good to know. But I'm not the associate chair. Thank goodness. It's okay. Just for the record, it was for many years, and I'm no longer. Yeah.
She often writes about cultural histories of reproduction and reproductive technologies. She's edited and written several other books on related topics, including Pregnancy Test and Abortion in the American Imagination Before Life and Choice, 1880 to 1940. Her other research interests include late 19th and early 20th century American literature, especially the novels of Edith Wharton, The History of Eugenics, Disability Studies, and Feminist Theory. She's a regular contributor to the peer-reviewed History of Medicine and gender blog, Nursing Clio. Please welcome Dr. Karen Weingarten.
Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, Cassandra. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read for you part of my introduction and then a few selections, but I'm going to pause along the way and if there are selections, I have things that I've chosen to read for you, but if there are other things you want me to read, I would be happy to do that. And then I'm hoping you will ask me questions, and no question is a bad question. I firmly believe that. And as you said before, anyone who asks me a question gets a free book, as long as I have enough for everyone. I can answer that question. You really want to know? I will be 45 in 2 weeks. Wow. Kind of a big birthday, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to read my introduction. It's called A Short History of Abortion and Its Representations Before Roe. And you might be wondering, why did I stop at Roe v. Wade? Like what, 1973? The answer is mostly permissions, because I had to get permissions for every piece that was published after 1925, I believe it is, 1926, and they get expensive, and we want to keep the cost of the book affordable. It only came out in paperback, which is nice. And so keeping the cost of permissions down is one way to keep the cost of the book down as well. Okay, so I will start with the introduction. How did American women access abortion before Roe v. Wade legalized the procedure across the United States in 1973? Although illegal abortion has often been represented by the clothes hanger, most women turned to abortionists, some who were licensed doctors and some who were not, to access the procedure. Women also collected and passed on knowledge about plants and chemicals that induced a miscarriage, especially in the colonial period. By the late 19th century, information about pills, herbs, and detergents that might cause a miscarriage often circulated by word of mouth in pamphlets and through euphemistic advertisements. During the 75-year period when abortion was illegal in every American state, women continued to seek abortions to control their reproduction, despite the laws that might have sent them to prison or the risky procedures that might have led to their death or debilitation. Abortion is as old as the human need to control reproduction. Studying representations of abortion in literature published before 1973 reveals that people will seek abortion even when it is illegal and even if it threatens their life and freedom. While abortion became a hotly contested issue starting in the late 19th century, it wasn't always illicit. Before the mid-19th century, there were few anti-abortion laws in the United States. What changed? The United States saw enormous social and political change in this era. The Civil War started and ended, finally eradicating slavery and ushering in the era of Reconstruction, which created new opportunities for social mobility for Black Americans. At the same time, immigration to the United States rose dramatically, especially from countries in Eastern and Southern Europe. Considered not quite white, immigrants from this part of the world were perceived as a threat to the country's identity as a nation of people who descended from Protestant Anglo-Saxons. Amidst all this, advances were being made in medicine, and doctors moved to professionalize themselves. The American Medical Association, also known as the AMA, founded in 1847, launched a campaign to discredit unlicensed doctors, often called quacks, midwives, herbalists, and all people who were not practicing medicine with an AMA-approved license. Horatio Storer, an anti-abortion activist doctor, spearheaded this crusade by citing the changing demographics of the United States to justify an AMA-sponsored campaign to outlaw abortion across the nation. He published books and pamphlets, gave lectures, and circulated articles linking what he called criminal abortion to the declining population of white Anglo-Saxon descended people. He saw the rise of immigration as a threat to the country, and he believed white middle-class women were having abortions at higher rates. He wasn't wrong in some ways. In Why Not? A Book for Every Woman, which he published in 1866, Storer asked readers, referencing the newly occupied Western territories of the United States, shall they be filled by our children or by those of aliens? This is a question that our own women must answer. Upon their loins depends the future of the nation. This argument lies at the foundation of his anti-abortion rhetoric. Abortion must be outlawed so that white women could not access it. White women, according to this logic, had an imperative to be mothers. State legislatures across the country began enacting laws to ban abortion. By 1900, every American state had a law prohibiting abortion. So the selections in this book from the pre-1900 era document the necessity and ubiquity of abortion and describe its use in women's lives as far more complicated than Storer's imagination allowed. Abortion was often used as a tool of resistance in oppressed and marginalized communities. The oral histories of formerly enslaved people demonstrate how indigenous and enslaved women used abortifacients, known plants and herbs that would induce a miscarriage, to prevent having children born into slavery. This form of resistance was twofold. It protected future children from having to endure the horror of slavery, and it prevented slave owners from increasing their profits. Abortion also allowed working class women to stay employed and to hide evidence that they might have had premarital sex, which can ruin a woman's reputation and her prospects for a future marriage. Prescribing abortifacients was a common practice for midwives and herbalists. And for much of the 19th century and in the centuries before, people didn't distinguish between a miscarriage that happened naturally and a miscarriage that was induced by an abortifacient. In fact, both were described as abortions, which is why Storer would often use the word criminal to distinguish between the two, right? A regular abortion, which is what we would refer to as a miscarriage day, and a criminal abortion is one that you would intentionally induce. At the time, if a woman experienced a pause in her menstrual cycle, she might have asked her local midwife or herbalist for something to bring her menses back without any mention of pregnancy. A missed period could mark a health issue or a potential pregnancy, and the same language described the two experiences. Only quickening, when the pregnant person could feel the fetus move, marked the beginning of pregnancy in this era. And this subjective indicator, subjective because only the person who's pregnant can feel quickening, is usually only felt after the first trimester, which meant that until reliable pregnancy tests were invented, many women didn't consider themselves pregnant until past the 12th week of pregnancy. So very different understanding of pregnancy than we have today. There were few objective tests, such as the hormonal pregnancy test or the ultrasound, to indicate otherwise. However, in the first few decades of the 20th century, everything changed. It's impossible to discuss the history of abortion in the United States without acknowledging its intersections with eugenics. Starting in the early 20th century, many Americans embraced eugenic ideology as an explanation for racist, ableist, xenophobic, and classist hierarchies and discriminatory practices. Most infamously, eugenics justified forced sterilization policies or the state's right to surgically sterilize people and render them infertile. In 1907, Indiana passed the first law allowing the state to sterilize people without their consent if they were deemed quote unquote unfit for parenthood while in state custody. 20 years later, the Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, upheld a state's right to sterilize someone without their consent if a state institution declared them quote unquote feeble-minded or mentally deficient. It's estimated that more than 20,000 Americans were sterilized without their consent, and sometimes even without their knowledge, meaning they didn't even know that they were sterilized. Black, Indigenous, and disabled women were disproportionately targeted under these laws, often because they came from poorer communities where people were more likely to be labeled mentally inferior or have children out of wedlock. And that's what the case is famous for. The young woman, the case is named after, Carrie Buck, she was forcefully sterilized because she had a child out of wedlock and she herself was born out of wedlock. And the judge in the case said, that they could they must be feeble-minded because they were having children out of wedlock. And that was that it made it okay to forcefully sterilize them. Between 1930 and 1970, the United States forcefully sterilized about almost a third of Puerto Rican women. Legalizing forced sterilization worked in sync with outlawing abortion because together they ensured that reproductive control remained in the state's hands. These laws belong to the same eugenic toolkit. Both anti-abortion and compulsory sterilization laws take reproductive decisions away from people by giving the state the final say over who gets to have children and who can control their reproductive life. Anti-abortion laws often work to coerce women to have children they didn't want in the name of increasing the white middle-class American population or insisting that a woman's greatest accomplishment is motherhood, while sterilization laws curtailed the reproductive lives of many Black, Indigenous, disabled, and poor women. It's not a coincidence that sterilization laws were created on the heels of anti-abortion laws. Together, these laws created a repressive reproductive climate for more than 70 years. While obtaining an abortion in the first half of the 20th century posed risks, having money and political connections allowed some women to find safe abortions in the United States, Mexico, and abroad. During the Great Depression, the number of abortionists and doctors willing to provide illegal abortions increased because of widespread poverty and unemployment. And urban areas like Chicago, New York City, and Los Angeles developed abortion rings of network providers who offered discreet abortion services. In economically precarious times, women were desperate to have fewer children or none at all, and doctors and others with any medical training were willing to perform illegal abortions to supplement their declining incomes. Writings about abortion also proliferated during this era, and abortion increasingly appeared in the plots of novels and short stories, even as authors portrayed abortion as an illicit choice and depicted characters having illegal abortions. They also represented how abortion was always seen as an option, despite the risks involved and the difficulty in accessing the procedure. So people often ask me, oh, but like certainly during the time abortion was illegal, it's not, you don't often see it in novels or short stories. And actually it's not true at all. There are way more examples than I could include in this book. This book creates a selection of texts, poetry, fiction, memoirs, oral histories, and essays, and one play actually by Eugene O'Neill, and I can talk more about that later, that represent how abortion was discussed, accessed, portrayed, and understood before Roe v. Wade legalized abortion and transformed the terms of the American abortion debate. That women had abortions before Roe was not a secret. Several of the stories and essays in this collection depict how knowing whom to contact for a safe and relatively inexpensive procedure was prized information shared among women. Because abortion was illegal and unregulated, its costs varied widely, and many women risked their health or their life when they couldn't afford the price of licensed doctors who performed abortions under more sanitary conditions. As the texts in this book reflect, access to abortions often depended on women's economic status, education, social circle, and age. And even during the 75 years when abortion was outlawed in every state, there were periods when it was more accessible and periods when it was less. After World War II, for example, crackdowns on illegal abortions increased as there was a concerted effort to increase the birth rate and to push women out of the workforce and back into the home. Abortion became harder to obtain, and abortion providers were required to take more risks to keep their clinics open. The selections authored in this book by abortionists, and there's two selections by memoirs written by abortionists from their own perspectives, providing illegal abortions, describe the dangerous conditions abortion providers faced and the reasons they continued to provide abortions despite facing imprisonment and risks to their safety. One of the women who I include a selection from her memoir. She went to prison many times, and every time she got out of prison, she went back to performing abortions, partially because women just kept showing up at her doorstep, and she had a really hard time saying no to them. While many of the texts included in the following pages make an argument for legal abortion or show how anti-abortion laws hurt women, a feminist pro-abortion movement didn't emerge until the late 1950s, really the early 1960s. I assume you all know who Shirley Chisholm was, right? So Shirley Chisholm's powerful speech to Congress in 1969 about the necessity of legal abortion, especially for Black and working class women, remains as relevant today as when she delivered it. And she was really the first congressperson to argue in front of Congress for legal abortion. It was during her first year as a congresswoman. So it was pretty brave of her to do that in 1969. Chisholm explained to her fellow Congress members, almost all men, that women from minority groups are more likely to have botched abortions that led to their deaths. In 1969, mishandled abortions were the largest cause of maternal deaths. And when women were forced to have children they couldn't afford, it was harder for them to break the cycle of poverty. Again, Chisholm provided her colleagues with statistics to back these claims. So I include her essay to Congress in this book. It's actually quite hard to find the full speech, and I wanted people to have access to it. Also in this era, Patricia McGinnis founded the first pro-abortion rights organization, the Association to Repeal Abortion Laws, to bring more attention to the harms of illegal abortion. Writing from the 1960s also reflects a new openness to abortion from abortionist Ruth Barnett's willingness to publish a memoir under her own name to articles in popular magazines making the case for legal abortion. Novels, stories, and poetry similarly depict how alternatives to abortion, like adoption, were not an easier option. You know, it's, as we like sometimes hear from the conservative side, like, oh, just people can just, you know, have a baby and put them up for adoption. And there's a beautiful poem in the collection by the Black poet Lucille Clifton, really addressing why that's an emotionally difficult option. I chose the texts that follow to represent the dominant narratives about abortion before Roe v. Wade. Placed together, they reveal the misogynist and racist arguments behind the 19th century campaign to outlaw abortion, and they represent the mid-20th century arguments for overturning those laws. Each selection in this collection tells us something significant about the period before 1973, when abortion was illegal. Even as some of the stories I've chosen might not represent abortion favorably, like the excerpt from Edith Wharton's Summer, they still depict the repercussions women face because abortion was vilified and associated with so-called fallen women. I selected texts that have been harder to find because they have been long out of print or not widely published. And I prioritized texts by women writers, and especially those who shared perspectives learned from personal experiences. Missing from this book is representation by Latinx, Asian American, and Indigenous writers who faced steep barriers to writing and publishing in the first half of the 20th century. Also not included are more canonical texts with abortion storylines. So I did not include Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like by Elephants, probably the most famous short story about an abortion. People often ask me about it. I did not include it. It's very easy to find out there. It's probably the most widely anthologized story about abortion from the early 20th century. William Faulkner's two novels, his two novels with abortion storylines, I don't include an excerpt from them. They're As I Lay Dying, and that has an abortion storyline. And If I Forget Thee, Jerusalem, a lesser well-known Faulkner novel, but also has there are two abortions in that novel. I won't give away what happens, but and then Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, if you've read that, based on a real life incident that led to a young pregnant woman's death, also kind of hinges on an inability to get an abortion, actually. Among less canonical novels that I didn't include are Lillian Smith's Strange Fruit, beautiful novel, it's just so long, hard to excerpt. Highly recommend this novel, though, which provocatively depicts why a Black woman might not choose to have an abortion, and Josephine Herbst's two novels with abortion storylines that mirror her experiences and her sister's. The two novels are Money for Love and The Executioner Awaits. Other less well-known novels from the first half of the 20th century are Sinclair Lewis's Anne Vickers. There's actually two abortions in that novel. Christopher Morley's Kitty Foyle. You might be more familiar with the movie that Ginger Rogers stars in. Yes, there's not an abortion in the movie because of the Hays Code, but the code that censored what could be on film at the time. I think Christopher Morley's from Long Island, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Anyways.
Yep.
Yeah, because we have a park.
Yeah.
Right. That's where we all need to go.
That's where all the demonstrations start.
Okay,
We
so
get the
next time you
buses
go
up
to
there, right near you guys, right?
next time you go to the park, you can think about his novel Kitty Foyle, and there's an abortion in it, depicted quite sympathetically, actually. And Vinya Del Mar's novel Bad Girl. I discuss all these novels in my first book, Abortion in the American Imagination. It's more of an academic book, published it almost 10 years ago, but might be interesting. And the archivist Leslie Hall has been listing abortion narratives, fictional and non-fictional, since 1998 on her website. And I give the website if you're interested. And then every few years, there are new works discovered in the archives, like Genevieve Taggart's Engaged, only recently republished in a collection by Boiler House Press. By the second half of the 20th century, literary references to abortion increased, and a comprehensive list of every work that touches on abortion would go on for pages. The afterwards of this book is written by Renee Bracey Sherman, a wonderful writer and activist. And in her afterward, she lists some contemporary novels that have abortions in them, and I really recommend reading her afterward. By bringing together literature published from the last era when abortion was widely outlawed, my hope is that readers will come away with an understanding of why legal and accessible abortion so often comes under attack. Upholding people's right to control their reproductive futures, to choose when and how to have children, is to give them tools to fight other forms of oppression. As the historian Laura Briggs has eloquently argued, all politics are reproductive politics. When people cannot choose the terms of parenthood, they are too often denied access to education, social mobility, stable employment, safe and healthy relationships, secure housing, and the list can go on. Connecting the necessity of legal abortion to the conditions that allow people to thrive is at the foundation of reproductive justice, a term coined by Black feminists and described by the reproductive justice activist Loretta Ross. As the following texts demonstrate, legal and accessible abortion allows people to have livable lives. Because of this, outlawing abortion will not stop people from seeking it, and because of this, abortion will continue to be represented in our stories. This book is an attempt to document how abortion is and will remain an integral part of the human experience. That's my introduction.
Oh, very good. Excellent.
Thank you. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you some excerpts, but if there's something that you are particularly interested in hearing me read, I'd be happy to do that. I wrote a head note for each piece to like contextualize it. And my goal for the collection was that as you go through the collection, and it starts with a very short piece by Maria Sibylla Marian. It's the only piece not written in English. She was a naturalist who traveled to Suriname in South America in the like very early 18th century. And she met enslaved indigenous people who told her, and she was actually, talk about botany, she was actually doing what your father does, and with botany and with insects, she was drawing plants and insects in Suriname, which she published in a book. And in this book that's mostly about plants and insects, she talks about the peacock flower and how enslaved indigenous women were using the peacock flower to have abortions because they didn't want to have babies born into slavery. And so I thought it was like, it's very short, but it was such a powerful description, and I thought it was a good way to start the collection. I also include WPA oral histories, like during the Work Progress Administration. Maybe you're all aware, there was during the Great Depression, people were actually paid to go around and talk to formerly enslaved people about their experiences under slavery. And it turned out that a lot of people shared experiences about using cotton root to have abortions during slavery, again, for the same reason, so that they wouldn't have children born into slavery. And so I thought that like including their experiences in their words was really important, even though there's been some controversy over whether some of the oral histories were coerced, because sometimes they were interviewed by white people, and sometimes they would describe the slave owners in sympathetic ways. So many of them talk about using cotton root to procure abortions. It seemed like that there must be some truth to that. And so I thought it was important to include that. And then I'm skipping around, but I include a one-act play by Eugene O'Neill, published in written in 1914. It is actually called Abortion, which is amazing, right? To use that title. It was never performed during his lifetime. And it's not performed very often, but the play is so short that I was able to include it in its entirety in the collection. And then I include an excerpt by Edith Wharton's novel Summer. Has anybody read Summer here? You
Yes.
have? Yeah. I love this novel. You might be more familiar with her novel Ethan Frome, right?
Yeah.
A lot of you might have read it in high school. She often called Summer her hot Ethan because it's much sexier. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from it because I think it's a really great. It summarizes really well, like some of my arguments. I include a poem by Georgia Douglas Johnson, who was a Black poet. I think she's the first Black writer to talk about abortion openly, and certainly in poetry. And Renee, who wrote afterwards, told me that in her research, she discovered that Georgia Douglas Johnson had a long affair with W.E.B. Du Bois. That's actually pretty well documented. And she wondered whether she was just kind of surmising, no evidence, maybe Johnson had this abortion while she was having this affair with Du Bois. You might know Du Bois wrote for Margaret Sanger's birth control review. They had a pretty close relationship. And so he was very active in the birth control movement. One of my favorite stories about abortion, actually Dorothy Parker, the writer Dorothy Parker, has two stories about abortion, and I include one of them, Mr. Durant. And skipping ahead, Langston Hughes has a wonderful short story about abortion called Cora Unashamed, and I include that in its entirety. I include a poem by William Carlos Williams. He was a doctor and a poet and a short story writer, and he has this really great poem about abortion called A Cold Front. How many of you have read or seen the mini-series Peyton Place?
Oh, yes.
Why that face? Why are you making that face?
Because it was
Busted.
It was first published in 1956, and it was
Right.
like a phenomenal bestseller. Like
Yes.
everybody read Peyton Place, and it became a TV show.
And a catchphrase.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
what?
A
Catchphrase.
catchphrase
Oh, right.
Yes.
for communities.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a real Peyton
Yes,
place.
yes, yeah. But I don't know if you remember, it has an abortion, and it was 1956. That was an era. There was a lot of pushback against abortion, and I could talk more about that. It became very, very hard to access abortion in the United States in the 1950s, and the fact that Peyton Place depicted an abortion sympathetically was quite controversial, but eye-opening for a lot of readers. It was a really, really significant moment and depiction, and I might read a little bit of it for you. As I said, I include 2 excerpts from memoirs written by people who performed abortions, one from 1962 and one from 1969. And then I also include an article that was published, an essay that was published in The Atlantic. It was published, then called The Atlantic Monthly. It was published anonymously by a woman who described the experience of getting an illegal abortion and how she went about it. And have you read it, or do you know? Okay, yeah, but it's a really, she both shows how hard it was and yet how easy it was, that it was just about talking to enough people, and eventually someone could connect you to someone who knew someone who knew, someone willing to give you an abortion, or where you might travel. Often on the West Coast, people tended to travel to Mexico. On the East Coast, sometimes people would travel to Puerto Rico to get, even though abortion was illegal in Puerto Rico and in Mexico, it wasn't like you can get a legal abortion there, but the state would or the country would kind of look the other way for Americans, right? Not for Mexicans or Puerto Ricans, but for Americans.
Because they paid.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly why. It's because they paid, right? And then, as I said, I include Shirley Chisholm's speech to Congress from 1969, and with the Lost Baby poem by Lucille Clifton. So if there's anything that you would really like me to read, I mean, some of it is long and I can't read it in its entirety, but I'd be happy to read it, or like read the head note. But I thought I would start by reading to you not the whole thing I publish, just a piece from Summer by Edith Wharton. In part because, so as I said, my first book was about representations of abortion, really just through I think I end around 1940 in that book. And Edith Wharton Summer is really the first novel that got me thinking about abortion in American literature. I read it as a graduate student, a PhD student, and it's what I ended up writing my dissertation about in part. And I think it got me thinking about, why representations of abortion matter. And so I'm going to read to you my head note, and then I'm just going to read to you a short bit from the novel, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. So, Summer contains the first explicit reference to abortion in a work of literary fiction. It was published in 1917. Edith Wharton wrote this novel during the First World War while she was working with refugees in France. Summer is about first love and the passion of youth, but it's also about how an unplanned pregnancy can upend all romance, especially when the man involved has no intention of marrying his lover. So in the novel, the main character, her name is Charity. She lives in this small town. She doesn't know who her biological parents are. She's been adopted by this wealthy lawyer in the town. And Harney, this young, handsome man from New York City, comes to the town to look at the architecture, and they have a summer fling, essentially. So there are 2 mentions of abortion in the novel. In the first, the protagonist, Charity, hears from her friend Allie about her sister's abortion and how it destroyed her life. And in the second, Charity herself visits the same abortionist to ascertain whether she's pregnant, but decides not to go through with the abortion. A juxtaposition of these two scenes, which are both excerpted, reveals Wharton's conviction that for unmarried women, the consequences of premarital sex were out of their control because of the misogyny inherent in early 20th century American society. At the same time, as you'll see when I read you this excerpt, Wharton resorts to common racist and xenophobic stereotypes of abortionists and the women associated with them. Dr. Merkel, the abortionist, described in the second scene, conforms to many of the stereotypes about abortionists that circulated at the time. She has an accent, she's ostentatiously wealthy, and she's cruel and greedy. Wharton further racializes the scene by describing Dr. Merkel's assistant, who opens the door for Charity, as being mixed race. Even as the novel's narrative is sympathetic to Charity's difficult circumstances as a young, sexually awakened woman, abortion figures as an option only for fallen women, and those who are closely associated with abortion will always be outsiders, according to the novel's logic. And so I just want to read to you this short scene, because just listen to the descriptions and how Wharton is describing the abortion clinic and Dr. Merkel. Up until this moment, Charity, she's had sex with Harney multiple times. Obviously, it's 1917, so we're not given a lot of detail, but there's no question that it happens. And then Harney leaves her, and he, writes her this letter, and he says, oh, basically, like societal pressures, I can't be with you. You must understand. And, she writes and says, yes, I understand. She kind of actually lets him go. And, but then she starts feeling dizzy and nauseous, and she's like, uh-oh, something is wrong with me. And she suspects that she's pregnant. And so she decides to go and visit. She goes to this town, this larger city. It's called Nettleton. It's fictional, or it's probably based on someplace, but it doesn't actually exist. And so the scene that I'm going to read to you, she's ringing the doorbell to the abortion clinic, and it's her friend Allie had described it to her because she told her about her sister Julia. So on the second landing, she rang a bell, and a mulatto girl with a bushy head and a frilled apron led her into a hall where a stuffed fox on his hind legs proffered a brass card tray to visitors. At the back of the hall was a glazed door marked office. After waiting a few minutes in a handsomely furnished room with plush sofas surmounted by large gold frame photographs of showy young women, Charity was shown into the office. When she came out of the glazed door, Dr. Merkel followed and led her into another room, smaller and still more crowded with plush and gold frames. Dr. Merkel was a plump woman with small, bright eyes, an immense mass of black hair coming down low on her forehead, and unnaturally white and even teeth. She wore a rich black dress with gold chains and charms hanging from her bosom. Her hands were large and smooth and quick in all their movements, and she smelt of musk and carbolic acid. She smiled on Charity with all her faultless teeth. Sit down, my dear. Wouldn't you like a little drop of something to pick you up? No? Well, just lay back a minute then. There's nothing to be done yet, but in about a month, if you'll step round again, I would take you right into my own house for 2 or 3 days, and there wouldn't be a mite of trouble. Mercy me, the next time you'll know better and to fret like this. Charity gazed at her with widening eyes. This woman with the false hair, the false teeth, the false murderous smile. What was she offering her but immunity from some unthinkable crime? Charity, till then, had been conscious only of a vague self-disgust and a frightening physical distress. Now, of a sudden, there came to her the grave surprise of motherhood. She had come to this dreadful place because she knew of no other way of making sure that she was not mistaken about her state, and the woman had taken her for a horrible creature like Julia. The thought was so horrible that she sprang up, white and shaking, one of her great rushes of anger sweeping over her. And she says, I'm leaving, I want nothing to do with you. And of course, Dr. Merkel says, okay, well, $5, please. And she doesn't have $5 to give her. And Harney, her lover, gave her one present. He bought her this beautiful brooch that was quite expensive, the nicest gift she'd ever gotten. And so Dr. Merkel points to that and says to her, give me that. And when you have the $5, you can come back and I will give you your brooch back. but until then, I'm keeping it. And to find out more, you should read the novel. It's a wonderful novel. I don't include all of it here. So I'm just gonna pause there. I can read you more, or I can, that I've chosen, I can, you can ask me to read something. I'd be happy to do that if you're interested, or you can ask me questions. We can have a conversation about anything I've said.
Well, just want to ask, is anyone on the Zoom? Are they?
Shelley.
Oh, Shelley, she can see
Yeah.
everything? Okay.
You know, I just want to point out that, and I may be wrong, but in the whole list of all the political issues, I think women's rights and health is at the bottom of the barrel, considering you know, there's only one person on Zoom and 4 people here.
What do you mean? Oh,
In the world, like in the,
Yes.
in terms of what we
And I
discussed.
think this is sort of indicative, because we usually have a few more people
Yeah.
on Zoom.
Yeah, I mean, I would say,
It really angers me, because I remember Bell Labs with the
Yeah.
big hat, and it was pointed out that if one part of society is not equal, then no one's equal.
yeah.
You
I mean-
know, and it's an important issue.
I've had that thought recently as well, and thinking about, you know, we read the news these days and there's so much it's overwhelming, intentionally
Yeah.
so, right? Like between
Yes.
people being threatened with deportation and like the EPA being cut and what's happening to education and immigration, right? All like it's hard to, I'm sure you all agree, right? It's like I'm in the right room for this. And at the same time, like abortion rights are being cut in state after state. And I've noticed recently that unless you intentionally look for it and follow it in the news, it's been subsumed by
Yes.
everything else. And
Especially it closed down, one of him is closed down too.
yeah,
Really?
Yeah, they closed it down for good.
yeah. And it's, I mean, in New York, we're fairly lucky even compared to what's happening in some
Yeah.
other states.
Red states.
In some red states where, I mean, recently, like Texas, Louisiana, they've tried to pass laws, you know, right? New York created a law protecting doctors that do telehealth with people in states that are red states where they don't have access to abortion, and saying if you do a telehealth appointment with someone in Texas and you ship them abortion pills for their abortion, New York will protect you. And now Texas and Louisiana have just passed laws trying to undermine that, and it will probably go to the Supreme Court, and it will be a huge, the decision of that will be enormous in terms of access to abortion for people
Yeah.
in red states if they determine that prescribing abortion pills across state lines is illegal, is criminal.
Yeah, I just want to say, the other scary thing is, I was speaking to someone who's a very pro-Trump, and she was talking about state rights. And I had to remind her that there was a civil war for that reason, because it was federal law against state rights.
Yeah.
So if you were legal, what was legal in New York has to be legal in Tennessee
Yeah.
or Kansas. That's the importance of federal law. And we're just falling apart here into state laws.
I mean, the other interesting thing is that a lot of states aren't even given the opportunity to vote for abortion. Like, I don't know if you remember, maybe about a year ago now, Kansas had the opportunity to vote for a referendum on abortion. And
They took it off the ballot.
yes,
Yeah.
overwhelmingly, people in Kansas were in favor of legal abortion and didn't want to criminalize abortion in the state. They wanted to keep their, you know, pro-abortion rights. But what we see is like a lot of state legislatures are passing these laws without even giving people the right to vote on it. In Florida, during the last election, they were going to pass a law protecting people's right to abortion. But then at the last minute, the governor said, oh, it needs to have a 3/4 majority or something like that. And so the law passed, the law didn't pass. It got something like 55% of people voted for it, but because it didn't
May I
have
have your
this.
attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes.
Sorry.
Which are brought materials? Please come to the checkout desk now.
There'll be other
The
ones.
public
too.
computers will be
Yes.
off
This is the first.
As long as they're not yelling at me.
Thank you.
Anyways, I said I would give a free book to whoever asked questions, and you asked a lot of questions, so go ahead. Or made comments, so that's the same thing,
But if
yes.
I want to, I
Yeah.
could buy this from.
You can buy it from
Penguin.
any bookstore, you go to online, in person, they'd have to order it, but yeah, it's.
What's
yeah.
your percentage of royalties?
I'm not sure, actually. It's probably pretty small.
Very low.
But it's
Author
fine.
gets almost nothing.
But I'm happy, I will say Penguin is a big press,
Oh, it is.
obviously, right? And when I started working with the editor, I was really impressed by her because she said, I don't want you to write a collection that's both sides. I don't want you to have a both sides collection. Like, this is not a collection where you're like, let's look at the issues from both sides. She's like, you can put together a collection that demonstrates the necessity for legal abortion. And I don't know if I would have done it otherwise. And I was really impressed that she did that. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of the both sides thing, the excerpt you read was from someone that was sort of casting the abortion clinic in a very negative light.
Yes.
So I'd like to hear something that contrasts with that.
Yeah, like why I decided to choose this excerpt that.
I just want to hear a different excerpt.
A different excerpt that portrays an abortion clinic positively. Yes.
But that's a good question.
Yeah.
As to why you chose it, but
Yeah. There are a number of excerpts. Let me see. I did not prepare one, but like Daughter of the Earth, which I didn't actually give to you, by Agnes Smedley. I don't know if she talks about the abortion clinic. But in Daughter of the Earth, which was published in 1929, do people know this novel by Agnes Smedley? Smedley was a communist. There are two abortions in the novel, and they're both portrayed very like sympathetically. Everything goes right. And then she decides to divorce her husband mostly because she's just tired of getting pregnant and she can't do anything about it. I think I'm going to read to you the excerpt from Peyton Place, because not that it portrays the abortion so positive, like Selena doesn't go to the abortion clinic, but she approaches her town doctor. And I want you to hear how he responds to her pregnant, to what she says to him. So, I'm pregnant. So she's going to talk to the town doctor. And she says, I'm pregnant, said Selena, and immediately bit her lip. She had not meant to blurt it out like that. What makes you think so? Asked the doctor. 2.5 months and no period makes me think so, said Selena. And this time she twisted her hands, for she had not meant to say that either. Come on in the other room, said Dr. Swain. Let's see what we can see. His hands were cool against her hot skin, and once again, her mind set up its prayerful refrain. Help me, Doc. You've got to help me. Whose is it? He asked when they had returned to the office. Now came the worst part, the part she had rehearsed so carefully in her mind so that she could phrase it in a way that would not antagonize the doctor. I am not at liberty to say, said Selena. Nonsense, roared the doctor, and she knew that she had failed. What kind of rot is that? You're not the first girl in the world who has to get married, nor in this town for that matter. Whose is it now? And no more foolishness. Young Carter's? No, said Selena. And when she bent her head forward, her dark hair swung softly on either side of her face. Don't you lie to me, shouted Dr. Swain. I've seen the way that boy looks at you. What gave you the idea he was inhuman? Come on now, don't lie to me, Selena. I'm not lying, said the girl, and in the next moment she lost control of herself and began to shout at him. I'm not lying. If it were Ted's, I'd be the happiest girl in the world, but it's not his. Doc, help me. Her voice went to a whisper. Doc, you told me that if I ever needed you to come and you'd come and help me. Well, I'm here now, Doc, and I need help. You've got to help me. What do you mean by help, Selena? He asked, his voice almost as soft as her own. How can I help you? Give me something, she said, something to get rid of it. There's nothing I can give you to take, Selena, that would help you now. Tell me who is responsible. Maybe I could help you that way. You could get married only after the baby is born. Selena's lips went tight. He's already married, she said. Selena, said Dr. Swain, as gently as he knew how. Selena, there is nothing I can give you at this point that will make you miscarry. The only thing now is an abortion, and that's against the law. I've done a lot of things in my time, Selena, but I have never broken the law. Selena, he said, leaning forward and taking both her cold hands in his. Selena, tell me who this man is, and I will see that he is held responsible. He'll have to take care of you and provide for the baby. I could work it so no one would know. You could go away for a little while until after the baby comes. Whoever did this thing to you would have to pay for that and for your hospitalization and for you to look after yourself until you get back on your feet. Just tell me who it is, Selena, and I'll do everything I can to help you. It's my father, said Selena Cross. She raised her head and looked Matthew Swain straight in the eyes. My stepfather, she said, and tore her hands away from him. She fell forward into the doctor's hardwood floor and beat her fists against it. It's Lucas, she screamed. It's Lucas. It's Lucas. And he gives her an abortion. It's a pretty powerful scene. You know, and I think people joke about Peyton Place sometimes because it is very soap opera, but you could see why this scene had such an impact on Americans. I mean, I don't think abortion should only be legal in cases of rape or incest, which this is clearly an example of, but for a lot of Americans, this was eye-opening, reading this and being like, what? Even she can't get a legal abortion? Even, you know, it's you know, barred from her under these horrible circumstances. And it really made people reconsider. And Dr. Swain, I mean, you could see he's so rigid at first and resistant to helping her. And it really changes his mind as well. And it was actually not unusual for some doctors to give some of their patients like to give people illegal abortions as part of their practice. There were some doctors who regularly did that. Some town doctors as well, small town doctors sometimes even agreed to do that. Yeah. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but there are other examples in the book of good experiences with abortion. And then the two examples, The Abortionist by Dr. X and They Weep on My Doorstep, are two memoirs by people who gave abortions, and they were very sympathetic to their patients. And One Woman's Abortion by Mrs. X, where she describes her real life experience getting an illegal abortion. It's a positive experience for her as well. You know, at the same time, there were thousands and thousands of women who had terrible experiences. And often the biggest risk you took when you had an illegal abortion is getting an infection, right? If the equipment was not sterilized properly. So you get an infection and that could kill you. Yeah, anyways, you asked me a question. I'll give you a book. I have one more book if anyone wants to ask me another question.
Could I buy that book?
This book?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it's
No,
Yeah.
Jerry could ask a question.
If you want to.
Okay, I'll read Alan's copy because I live with him.
I'll read.
Yeah.
You wanted to give this to somebody else. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, you want to give it to someone else?
Yes.
I see. I see. Yes.
But if Jerry wants it, that's
Yeah.
fine.
You can
I'll go on.
Jerry's got to ask his own question.
Yeah.
I also brought my last book, the pregnancy test. It's a very, very thin, short book. It's published by the series Bloomsbury puts out called Object Lessons, which each book is about a different object. Really nice. They do a really good job. They're
Good design, yeah.
You could see some of the books. I think there's like 70 books in the series now. And people think, though, the pregnancy test, like,
They showed on a Lifetime movie too.
what?
Lifetime movie, The Pregnancy Test.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's about 17 teenagers trying to get pregnant.
Oh, interesting.
For
Nice.
abortion.
Oh, I mean, this book tells the history of the pregnancy test, which is actually a fairly new invention. And certainly the stick pregnancy test that you see on the cover, this was only invented in 1988.
Wow.
Yeah, after I was born, as you now know.
Well, I was a lab tech in the 60s.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and in the lab, I was in chemistry, but there was someone who did the pregnancy test with the rabbits. And
Yes,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
She had her own room.
Yeah.
And all- rabbits, and they,
Poor
they had
rabbits.
to kill the rabbits, I guess.
Yeah,
and
so I
stuff
talk about that history about
Yeah.
how the first pregnancy test required you killing an animal to
Right.
find out, and it was because basically what they did is they would take a woman's urine, inject it into the animal, and if the urine had HCG, the hormone that we still test for pregnancy for today, if the woman's urine had HCG, meaning she was pregnant, the rabbit's ovaries would swell in response to the HCG, and that's how they knew she was pregnant. And if they cut open the rabbit and the ovaries looked normal, it meant it was a pretty horrible way to test for pregnancy.
I guess there was a time, I didn't really discuss it with that tech, but I guess there was a time it took to develop too, to have an effect on the ovaries, I guess.
Yeah, usually had to wait a few days.
Yeah, it wasn't an instantaneous.
It wasn't
test.
instantaneous by any means. And then after the rabbit test, they actually found a frog in South Africa where you could inject urine into it was actually a toad, I think. And the toad would release eggs if your urine had HCG. And the benefit of that was that you didn't have to kill the toad, right? You could use it over and over again. You had to let it like rest in between, but they were aquatic toads, so you had to have like big aquariums in order to keep them. So it wasn't great either. And then eventually they developed a lab pregnancy test where it was like, you mix all these chemicals together. And that was and then that sped things up a little bit, and you didn't have to develop you didn't have to kill any animals or keep any animals in your lab. And I interview this wonderful woman named Meg Crane, who still lives in Manhattan. She's in her 80s today. And in the late 1960s, she's an artist, and she was working for the pharmaceutical company Organon, and saw their lab pregnancy test, right? So the ones that they were using without animals. She saw the test tubes hanging, and she asked a doctor, like, what are these tubes? And he explained to her how the pregnancy tests work. And so she went and just took that science and designed a home pregnancy test that could be used at home. But Organon did not want to sell it in the US because they were worried. They were explicitly worried it would lead to more abortions, right? So it was first marketed in Canada and then in Amsterdam and in other European countries. And Meg Crane developed the test in 1969. They started selling it in Canada in 1971. It would take until 1978 before it was allowed to be sold in the United States. So just to give you a sense of this country's conservative politics when it comes to reproduction and letting people have kind of a say.
Are you a historian primarily, or is it?
I mean, I am in an English department. Yeah, I teach in an English department. Yeah. And so this book is the first half of it is the history of the pregnancy test. And then the second half of it looks at representations of the pregnancy test in culture, in novels, but also in popular culture, and thinks about how the pregnancy test has changed our relationship to what it means to be pregnant, and how the pregnancy test has become a kind of stand-in for pregnancy itself in various forms of media. And once I realized that, almost every television show, novel I read where like someone finds out they're pregnant, you realize there's a pregnancy test. It's like this technology that's become so ubiquitous, it's almost invisible. And I was really interested in looking at how it's kind of become so invisible, and yet it impacts how we think about reproductive bodies. So, but some people call me a cultural historian. I like that. Yeah.
You know, when I belonged to the League of Women Voters.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, early on in our marriage, so maybe late earlies, late 80s, early 90s. They had some buses and we were gonna go up to Albany, and it was sponsored by Planned Parenthood.
Yeah.
And they had Hillary Clinton, and I said, I gotta go. My fear of crowds be damned, I'm on the
Have your
bus.
attention, please. The library will be closing at 9 p.m. Please bring all materials to check out this now. All public computers will be turned off at this time. The quiet study rooms and restrooms will be locked in 5 minutes. Thank you.
So what happened? She gets up and talks, and it's rather unimpressive what she's saying. And then to end, she says, and you know, some of those pro-life people are very nice people. And I thought, you're talking to Planned Parenthood.
Yeah.
And she entertained no questions and then just walked off.
This was Clinton.
Yes.
I mean, Clinton was notoriously anti-abortion. She was, I mean, she would say that she was, you know, pro-choice, but she had those famous words where she was like, abortion should be legal but rare or something like that. And I don't remember the exact language she used.
But she believed in war. There was not a war she didn't fight.
And you know, I think ultimately, I like, if you notice in my introduction and throughout the book, I don't ever use the language of pro-choice, because I don't consider myself pro-choice. Choice was like a language around abortion that was created in the late 70s, actually, well, after Roe. And it was almost as a way of like pretending that women didn't have abortions, that it was something bad. And I'm actually very interested in destigmatizing abortion. I see abortion as something that is like a natural part of the human experience. You know, people, as I said in the introduction, people have always been having abortions for as long as possible, for as long as, you know, people have gotten pregnant, which is obviously we're human beings. So like, that's how we reproduce. I mean, maybe when we were like multicellular animals, we found other ways to reproduce, but you know what I mean. And I think by using the language of pro-choice instead of saying like pro-abortion, I think it's a way of obscuring and still attaching abortion with stigma, which is something that the anti-abortion movement created. I also don't call them pro-life. I call them anti-abortion, because that is what they are. They are not pro-life. They are anti-abortion.
Yeah.
So I'm very careful about the language I use in describing them. And Clinton was part of that. You can actually track how people saw abortion in the US by looking at how narrow the national organization, it's the National Organization for Abortion Rights. And when it started in the 1960s, it was a very radical organization. They wanted to repeal all abortion laws. That was their goal. And they stood for the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. Then after Roe v. Wade, they changed their name. They kind of lost sight of repealing all abortion laws, which I think was a mistake. And they became like the National Action League for Abortion Rights or something like that. Then in the 90s, they decided not to have abortion in their name anymore, and they changed the organization to NARAL, stands for nothing. They didn't call themselves that, but that is essentially what it was. But they called themselves NARAL Pro-Choice, and the NARAL stood for nothing. And now they finally have changed that, and now they've taken away the NARAL, and now they call themselves Reproductive Freedom for All. Still no abortion in their name, but you know, at least they're a little bit more open about what they're doing rather than
started getting mad at them in the late 70s, and I mean, I don't really have any direct skin in the game, and I'm not privy to whatever politics they thought they had to deal with, but I felt like they've ceded the high ground to the opposition, acting like this is not a moral issue and we're not going to talk about any of those stuff. And I thought that they should not be doing that. They should be talking about, we're on the right side.
Yeah, I think they did. I mean, the anti-abortion movement really grew after Roe v. Wade. It was really powered by the Catholic Church at first.
Randall Terry and those
yeah,
people. too.
yeah, and they took it, rather than taking an offensive position, they kind of took everything was just defense, and they kind of lost control of the narrative, I think.
Yeah.
In your studies, did you come across, I remember this Bill Baird?
Yes, I know who he is,
Yeah,
yeah.
is that, I remember like. in the
Did you know
60s.
him?
No, well, I don't know him, but I saw
Yeah.
him, I think he was like in Huntington, around Long Island, at different
Yeah, I
point.
think that's right.
And I think he was advocating his birth control, and that was a problem in Long Island and stuff. Does he? I'm just curious. I don't know too much about him, but he seemed like he was, important in these.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm working on a project right now that is about the 1960s. So that
Yes.
is why I know
Yeah.
his name. And he became very active in the abortion rights movement.
Right.
And I don't know if he ever served on the board for NARAL, but when it was still like in its early forms, but he was definitely connected to all the abortion rights activists working in
Right.
New York in the 60s and 70s, like Larry Lader and Betty Friedan eventually became involved with them as well, and Shirley Chisholm, of course, and then New York State, you might know, maybe even remember, passed a pro-abortion law before Roe v. Wade, right? New York had the most liberal law.
Right.
It passed an abortion law in 1971, legalizing abortion.
Increase in 1972, abortion is increasing
Yeah,
in the US during the Nixon administration.
it increased.
In 1972,
Yeah.
73.
73 was when Roe v. Wade passed. Yeah, but like before that, so like a few states passed abortion laws. Hawaii passed one, but Hawaii's law wasn't really great. California passed kind of a weak law, but New York was the first. New York passed the first law that didn't require you to live in the state, and that was a really, really big deal, because the first year that New York legalized abortion, half of abortions came from out of state, not surprisingly.
Right.
Which is still probably the case today, actually.
Well, but the father from Planned Parenthood was mother saying she didn't want to sterilize the African American women from having children.
Sanger did not sterilize. I mean, that is often like a misconception about Sanger. I mean, Sanger believed in eugenics, right? Sanger believed that certain people should have children and certain people should not have children, and that was like unfortunately part of the eugenic movement. For Sanger, her belief in eugenics actually was less along racial lines and more along like disability, right? I mean, and it was a common belief at the time, like, like having babies that are disabled is bad. Like we should, encourage people to have healthy children. And part of the practice of having healthy children was limiting the number of children people had. But if you're interested in like the history of Sanger, Renee Bracey Sherman has a new book out called Liberating Abortion. And I think she does a good job redeeming Sanger in this book. Renee is a Black feminist. She runs this organization called We Testify, which collects abortion stories from women of color. And she's doing great work, and her book Liberating Abortion is a really great book. But I think that the right Sanger was not a saint by any means, but I also think sometimes her words get misconstrued. Like Du Bois was a believer in eugenics too. I mean, it was such a mainstream ideology in the early 20th century. It doesn't make it an okay ideology, but people believed that like some people should reproduce and other people should not reproduce. And that was the way of, advancing the human race and creating better people. And there were Black Americans who believed it and white Americans who believed it. Many more white Americans than Black Americans believed it. But it was a disturbing ideology that really existed through the 1970s and 80s, and some people argue we still see remnants of it. today.
It's like social Darwinism is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people talk about like, you know, Nazi Germany, right? There were these horrible
Oh,
And
eugenics
have your
practices.
attention, please. The library is closing at 9
Yeah,
p.m.
we have to leave
Okay.
at
The
9.
library is closing
Yeah.
at 9 p.m.
All right,
Supposedly the Nazis got the
Thank you.
idea from
the Americans,
Americans.
yes,
right?
that's
Cold
what,
Spring Harbor over here,
yes,
right?
that's
Yeah.
exactly, that's
Yeah,
exactly
that's
what.
right.
Anyways, you can have a copy of my book as well, and does anyone want this, a copy of this?
I would like.
Yeah, you
know, I
can have
didn't
it.
ask a question.
Yeah, you are